Thanks, Isaac. Good morning. Let's start with prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the gifts and abilities you have given to us here at Faith. Show us how to develop and use them in the manner you intended. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Pastor Lee asked me to speak a little bit about gifts and using your giftedness to do God's work. I tried to think of illustrations and examples to try to show that. And as I was thinking about it, I kind of had a V8 moment where I just, what about this? 3 years ago, none of this existed. Faith Lutheran Church wasn't in existence 3 years ago. And during that 3 years, there was much work that needed to be done and many challenges that needed to be faced. And God did that work through the giftedness of His people. One important lesson I've learned here is the challenges we faced and the amount of work that needed to be done at Faith did not exceed the giftedness of His people. There's a saying I've heard a couple pastors use when they're describing a new program or something new that their church is doing. And it goes something like this. The good news is this program is completely paid for. The bad news is the money is still in all of your pockets. The same is true for the work that needs to be done and the needs that exist in the church and outside the walls. I believe that He has already planted the giftedness in His people to do that work. We just have to be willing to develop those gifts and use them. Some gifts are very tangible. It's appropriate that Carlton did the children's sermon. You can see his gifts. You can feel them. You can touch them. Some gifts are a little more behind the scenes. A church like this needs lots of Sunday school teachers, committee members, and even people to clean the church on weekends. That's largely done behind the scenes, but it's every bit as important. As you grow, you start to discover your giftedness. Maybe it's just an aptitude that you find you have, or something that you feel led to do, something that you find easy. That's an internal confirmation of your gifts. I think it's important to complete that with an external confirmation. And that's usually as simple as somebody saying, you know, you're really good at that. An unsolicited response from somebody. It kind of completes that. If you have those two things, an internal confirmation and an external confirmation, you can be relatively sure that that giftedness does exist in you. The reason that God gave us that giftedness is pretty simple. And it's listed on the back of the cross that I wear around my neck. It says, Christ is counting on you. In the Bible, there are stories of a pillar of fire leading the Israelites, or a burning bush, or angels appearing to do God's work. And I believe that miracles still happen. But I believe that most of the work that God needs to do in this world is done through the giftedness of His people. Once you establish and understand your giftedness, you have to be willing to use it. The more you use it, the more it develops into a mature gift. This willingness can be held back, usually by fears. Fear of failure, fear of looking foolish, or stepping out of your comfort zone, or a fear of public speaking. If I was to do a personal assessment of my own, I've been described by others as steady, dependable, a plodder. Doesn't take much to go from there to there. I really can't fix anything myself. I do have some tools at home, and I'm really good with one of them. That's my phone. I call somebody that knows what they're doing. So what can you do with that? On July 7th, Lee's message was on prayer, specifically the Lord's Prayer. And he talked about Luther's interpretation of the two lines, Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done. Luther interpreted that to mean God's kingdom will come. His will be done, whether we help or not. But I believe He wants us to help Him usher in His kingdom. I also believe that if you ask God how you individually and we collectively can help usher in His kingdom, He'll make it known to you. It might be just a whisper, and you have to listen carefully for that. It might be a friend coming up to you and saying, recognizing a need and saying, I think you'd be good at that. Or maybe you recognize a need yourself. I would encourage you to act on that. I want to talk a little bit about a personal story of mine, about my involvement with a group of young men and how God used two rather ordinary gifts in me to place me there. I can communicate fairly well. I'm a salesman. It's what I do for a living. And I have a love of basketball. Without a doubt, my favorite thing about basketball is rebounding. I love to rebound when I played. There was just something about it. And rebounding has a double meaning. It's basketball meanings, and then it speaks to, in life, how you deal with adversity, how you respond to troubled times. Strictly from a basketball standpoint, there are two types of rebounds. Defensive rebounds, where you stop the opponent and you get the ball back for your team. And then offensive rebounds. Offensive rebounds are unique because there can be multiple offensive rebounds in one sequence. If you ever want to hear a crowd go crazy at a basketball game, listen to them cheer for their team. If their team gets 3 or 4 different offensive rebounds by 3 or 4 different people and then finally scores, it means everybody on the team is putting out all the effort they can to advance their cause. It might also mean they're bad shots, but There's a saying that's said often that sports builds character, and I agree with that. I also think sports reveals character. I could usually tell you how somebody would respond to adversity off the court based on how they played on the court. As my playing days were coming to an end, I was getting close to 50. My aches and pains were catching up to me. I had done some youth coaching with my oldest son, Brady, who graduated in 2005, and my youngest son, Casey, who graduated in 2009. I was wondering if this chapter in my life was going to close, and I felt led to take the coaching maybe one more step. I approached Coach Hake here in Spencer to see if he would like some help with the varsity, and he welcomed me with open arms. I needed to get my coaching certificate to do this, because even if you volunteer, you need that nowadays. I found a program through Iowa Lakes at the Spirit Lake campus that was compressed into about 30 days. It was 4 nights a week and 5 hours a night, and it took 4 weeks to get this coaching certificate. And I had the opportunity during those years to work with some young men and formed relationships that last to today. But specifically, I want to talk about the experience in 2009. This was not a championship season in the textbook definition, but it was very impactful for me and the young men that I worked with. Some of you already know this story, but I'm going to tell it from my perspective. And I'll start with the story of 2 young men. The first young man is Chris. Chris was a very shy young man and very likable. I remember when I asked him when he was in 4th grade if he wanted to play on a traveling basketball team. He looked out from behind his mom long enough to shake his head yes. As Chris grew, it became evident that he was going to be a very good athlete. He was strong, fast, he had good hands. He grew to be about 6'5" and 220 pounds. He was a good football player, but when you put a basketball in his hands, it was natural. Chris had a very good junior year, and things were set up pretty well for him when he was a senior. And then he made some poor decisions after his junior year and became ineligible for his senior year. This was very disappointing for him, and for all of us, because he could be one of our best players. But to his credit, he picked himself up, got himself in shape, and went on to play at Iowa Lakes. I remember reading his box scores in the paper, and I even ran into him a few times in Esterville when I was going through for work. It seemed like Chris had his life together, and things were going pretty well for him. Sometime after that, he fell in with the wrong crowd. One night, Chris got into a fight, and the man he got into a fight with was hurt very bad, put in the hospital, and he later died. And now Chris was charged with his murder. This was very devastating. Chris was being held downtown here in the Clay County Jail, waiting his trial. I felt led to visit him, but I've never visited anybody in jail before. I didn't know what to do, what to say. So I prayed about it and thought about it. And I just wanted to convey two things to him: that I cared about him and I've been thinking about him. And when you visit downtown here, you make an appointment ahead of time. It's 15 minutes, and you talk through a telephone to a TV screen, and you stand the whole time. So the first visit, I told Chris that I cared about him and that I'd been thinking about him. He asked some questions about classmates, and we talked a little bit about basketball. And all things considered, considering the circumstance, the visit went pretty well. As his sentencing got closer, I wanted to visit him again. And the second visit went similar to the first one. We even laughed a little bit. But when I got back to my truck, I got kind of emotional. I still remember the young man I asked in 4th grade, "Did you want to play?" But yet a man is dead. How do you reconcile these things? Matthew 25 popped into my mind. And there's a line in there that says, "When I was in prison, you visited me." And I realized that God wanted me to care. And he wanted Chris to know I cared. And for now, that's enough. The second young man I'd like to talk about is Taylor. Taylor was a very happy young man. He always had a smile on his face. Sometimes he was so happy it kind of bordered on goofy. He also grew into a very good athlete. Tall and thin. He was a good distance runner, very good soccer player, and a very good basketball player. The summer of Taylor's senior year, we were playing Algona in a second round game, and Taylor made a layup and his momentum carried him out of bounds. As he was coming back onto the court, he collided with a player from Algona accidentally. His chin hit the top of this young man's head, and Taylor went down, and he didn't move. And he laid there for a long time. The gym was silent. Don Pfaffenbach was in the crowd, and the first responders were called. Don came out to help. And Taylor was taken off on the backboard. Nobody wanted to finish that game, but we had to. There was about 4.5 minutes left. We went on to win the game. The young man that he collided with from Algona didn't come back in the game. He went back to the end of the bench and sat there. As it turns out, his mom and Taylor's mom played basketball together in high school. After the game, we talked to the team a little bit, and everybody's thoughts were with Taylor. So most of us went to the ER in time to see him being taken to the helicopter and flown to Sioux Falls. I had a customer in Sioux Falls. The game was on a Saturday night. I had a customer in Sioux Falls that I went to most Tuesdays. So I left early that following Tuesday morning to visit Taylor in the hospital. And when I walked into his hospital room, he still had his game jersey on. And he had a neck collar, and he was immobilized because he was being treated for a pretty serious neck injury. I came back and let the guys at practice know what Taylor's condition was. If I remember right, he had some feeling in his hands and feet and some movement, but the prognosis was uncertain. We had a game that following Thursday night, a district final game, at a neutral site in Cherokee against MOC. They were really good. Those Dutchmen know how to play basketball. I think they were ranked 3rd or 5th in Class 3A. We played the game, and at halftime we were tied. And when Coach Hake and I were walking off to talk to the guys in the locker room, the MOC coach was walking next to us, and he said, "How is it that you guys have as many losses as wins when you play like that?" We ended up losing the game, but I was so moved by the effort that these young men put out that I did something I haven't done before or since. I wrote a letter to the editor. I've never written a letter to the editor before, but I felt moved to do it this year by a group of young men who showed a lot of heart and courage this season. The Spencer boys basketball team finished the season with a 12-11 record after a loss to MOC Floyd Valley in the district final. During the season, these players had to deal with a lot of adversity literally from the start of practice right up to the last game. The team that finished the year was different from the one that started it, both in the actual roster and the players themselves. This group became closer and stronger with each piece of bad news or challenge that they faced. Friendships were either formed or strengthened as the season moved along. By the time we reached the last game of the season, you could look at all the faces in that locker room and know without any doubt that they would give their personal best to each other. I know the weather was bad, and that made travel to the MOC game in Cherokee difficult, but I wish more people from Spencer could have been there. Most of the players had Taylor Chapman's initials or jersey number on their shoes or a sweatband. New shooting shirts were made with the number 13 and TMC for all the players to wear during warm-up. They would play this game for Taylor, listening on his mom's laptop in his hospital bed in Sioux Falls. As was the case many times this year, we were playing against an opponent that was bigger and stronger, but we played right with them. They were playing for a fallen teammate, and boy did they play. We ended up losing, but we were completely spent and exhausted after the game. Even with a loss, there was a sense of pride and accomplishment in the locker room. They played as hard as they possibly could. I know that success in high school athletics is measured by wins and losses, as it should be. But these guys faced and overcame more in one season than most teams will see in 5. There were prayers, laughter, and tears all season long, but they played through it and relied on each other and became better for it. I'm very proud of this group of young men and admire very much the way they responded to what happened to them on and off the court. Coach Hake has a saying, well done is better than well said, and that certainly applies to these guys. Just to kind of wrap up Taylor's story a little bit, he recovered from his injuries. He was told by his doctors no more contact sports of any kind. No soccer, no basketball. So he began training to be a distance runner and went on to become an All-American distance runner at Morningside College. I remember that following August, I was driving from Milford south to the lakes. And as soon as I got to the tank farm south of Milford, I saw Taylor running by the side of the road. And I smiled all the way to Spencer. There's a lot more to Taylor's story, but I don't really have time to talk about it right now. He looks an awful lot like that young man sitting right over there. And these young men faced a lot of challenges that year. And they did it by using their gifts and abilities for one common bond, the team. God used 2 rather ordinary gifts in me to place me there, and I'm glad He did. As I look out in this congregation, I see a high level of giftedness, both individually and collectively. And if we are willing to develop and use those gifts to do God's work, we can fulfill our mission statement to come and worship and go and work. Amen.
Amen.